Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first Extension Disaster Education Network Professional Development Webinar for 2020. My name is Rodney Stone and I'm the USDA Liaison assigned to Tuskegee University in sunny Alabama. Please take a moment and drop your name and institution in the chat box so that we know who is with us today. Today, our presentation will be Developing Community Resilience to Power Outages, Energy Storage Resources for Public Education, and Project Development for Emergency Managers and Extension Personnel. And our speakers are Catherine Harrelman and Jennifer Menier. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in your Zoom control panel. I'll bring them up at the end of the presentation. I would also like to note that this webinar is being recorded. I've also included a link in the chat box for the webinar evaluation survey. Please take a moment to complete the evaluation at the conclusion of this webinar. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenters. Our presenters today are Catherine Harrelman and Jennifer Menier. Catherine is a broadly trained geoscientist and risk communicator who creates municipal solutions for the increasingly complex global environment, challenges which must be addressed by local governments, such as future-proofing public infrastructure and preparing vulnerable populations for extreme weather events. She is the statewide Extension Disaster Education Coordinator for the Cornell Cooperative Extension in New York, where she works with multidisciplinary teams focused on the intersection of disaster preparedness, energy technology, innovation, and local policy development to facilitate deployment of technologies which increase community resilience in natural disasters. Jennifer is a senior project manager in the Clean Energy Siting Group at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, where she helps guide local government officials through best practices and appropriate local laws and permitting procedures for solar and battery energy storage. Catherine, it's all yours.
Rodney, and thank you everyone for your time today. Jen and I sincerely look forward to your questions and your participation in this webinar, so please feel free to ask questions as well as hold longer questions till the end of our presentation. We have a lot of exciting material to get through together. So today's focus is going to be on battery energy storage systems, which encompass a wide range of different technologies with a variety of applications and benefits. And we're going to focus on how battery energy storage systems can be used to provide backup power to communities, which is typically referred to as community energy storage. So I'd like everyone to take a look at this animation of the California fire season weather. This is the first and foremost reason why we are discussing this topic together today. As you can see on this graph, the trends have continued to worsen with conditions trending further toward hotter and drier conditions. The 2019 blackouts prompted the California Public Utilities Commission to boost the equity budget for those who are at the greatest risk of blackouts, such as people on life support machines or low-income families with infants or elderly relatives that are reliant on technology such as air conditioning. California regulators have proposed a $513 million budget from 2020 to 2024 to give battery solar backup systems to those at greatest risk of wildfires and blackouts. This equity budget funding toward high-risk customers can almost completely cover the upfront costs of a typical residential solar system. While California is a significant right direction, we're very about Emergency managers and community educators and extension agents need to be prepared for a growing need, not only to integrate content about new backup power technologies into disaster preparedness resources, but also more broadly to internalize the changes in a new norm in disaster response. That battery energy storage technology will enable more people to shelter in place during and after natural disasters. This new norm presents exciting opportunities and also new challenges for the disaster response and the broader disaster research communities. How is the Extension Network currently responding to these changes? Well, first, we're going to briefly examine a community needs assessment project that my colleagues at UC-ANR and I are engaged in, which may serve as a model for other states. In 2019, we saw that the public safety power shutoffs, as they're being referred to now, the PSPS, had wide-reaching community impacts across California, which were extensive enough that many people lost power at multiple significant locations, including their homes, their workplaces, including rural workplaces such as farms or ranches. Unfortunately, utility companies have provided very few educational resources that allow people to prepare. Because of the opportunity to prepare in advance for PSPS events, several days in advance, although there are many challenges ahead, the University of California Agriculture and Outdoor Resources Group identified the potential to increase community resilience to these events through increased outreach and education. Currently, UC-ANR's team is disseminating an online survey to assess the need for educational resources, which would help communities and individuals prepare for and respond to power outages. In a future Eden webinar, their team will report out on the survey results. I'm displaying their current research because I'm encouraging other extension personnel and emergency managers involved in community education to get in touch with the project lead, Susie Coker. Susie is a forestry advisor at the Central Sierra Cooperative Extension and is the best person to contact to review the survey questionnaire, which I hope will be adopted and standardized for use in other states so that we can understand what communities do and do not understand about how to prepare for and respond to power outages, including establishing community literacy on what backup storage technologies are and what function they may serve during and after power outages. So what is the other reason why we are discussing this topic now? Well, there's a lot of innovation going on both in terms of energy policy and technology development. The capital expenditures involved in modernizing the US grid are absolutely immense. In particular, projects involving transmission line updates and new line construction can take anywhere from 2 to 20 years from the initial design phase to completion. Although these projects move slowly and there are typically multiple periods for public comment, the window of opportunity that we have to design elements which would allow for the future installment of community energy storage systems and the creation of microgrids close surprisingly quickly. Historically, emergency managers and extension personnel have not been involved in project design discussions because community resilience was not explicitly designed into these types of engineering projects, a paradigm that is rapidly changing. Over the next 2 years, it is critical that these large projects, as they're being developed, that all of us in our communities connect to state and federal officials to share knowledge and ensure that 2 objectives are met. 1, that developing community resilience to power outages continues to be a major objective of the US power grid modernization. And 2, that sufficient continuing funding for education and outreach is allocated to develop and maintain community literacy about how these complex technologies across the product lifecycle are affecting people's individual welfare. Literature created by the Department of Energy, the Public Technology Institute, and the National Association of State Energy Officials from 2008 to 2012, which currently guides emergency managers and local governments on energy assurance planning, was very well researched and effective, but energy technology is continuing to innovate rapidly, much faster than even in the previous decade. Not only does the guidance need to be updated, but also the content and delivery training strategies need to be carefully considered such that communities have consistent access to vetted, evidence-based knowledge about these technologies that are playing an increasingly complex role, again, in the welfare of individuals, as well as the sustainability of businesses across the entire disaster cycle, which sounds very much like a role for extension. This brings me to the final point in our introduction. So currently, the comment period for the Department of Energy's Energy Storage Grand Challenge is about to open. What is the Energy Storage Grand Challenge? It will focus resources from across the U.S. Department of Energy to create a comprehensive program to accelerate the development, commercialization, and utilization of next generation energy storage technologies to sustain global leadership in energy storage. The Grand Challenge is building on $158 million in Advanced Energy Storage Initiative announcement funds from fiscal year 2020. What I'm doing is tasking each of you to think throughout this presentation about how your communities could be impacted by having greater resilience to power outages and to natural disasters, and to work with me to submit to the Department of Energy your comments over the next 6 to 9 months about how community resilience to power outages and more broadly to natural disasters can positively shape the technology design and deployment in the United States, as well as the necessary public and education outreach strategies that need to be designed so that the objectives of the Energy Storage Grand Challenge is met. I'm trying to get out in front of this because this traditionally has not been a relationship that has been key to extension personnel who primarily function and interact with USDA. All right, so that is our introduction. I would like to pass it over to my colleague, Pierre Jen Manier, who's going to talk a little bit more and give us an introduction to battery energy storage systems.
See my screen?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. I think I got muted and then unmuted, but I'm here now, so perfect. So like I was already introduced, my name is Jennifer Manier, and I'm at NYSERDA on our clean energy siting team, which means I work with local governments across the state to help them prepare for clean energy development, be it solar, wind, or more recently, also battery energy storage. So in New York, we have some pretty ambitious goals. I think some of the most ambitious in the country, if not the most ambitious. We're looking to have 100% carbon-free electric system by 2040. And there's a lot of money behind it. It's a 10-year, $5 billion commitment. Try not to get too bogged down in all of the text on these slides. It's really just so that you can reference it after the fact. I'm actually trying to squeeze a 2-hour presentation into about 15 minutes, so bear with me and we'll try to get to questions after. So the point of this slide is we have a lot of ambitious targets to meet. And one of the many ways that NYSERDA and New York State in general are getting there is through our annual large-scale renewables solicitation. This is just a snapshot of last year. It's about 20 projects, mostly solar, some wind, and a few of them with energy storage. Our 2017 solicitation looked pretty similar to this, a similar number of projects and funding, and we expect that the 29 solicitation results will look also fairly similar as far as funding and the number of projects. And these are really just the large projects that we're funding in the state. There are plenty more going on, but these are all the big ones. If you take a quick peek at the map, the smallest you're going to see is about 20 megawatts, anywhere up to hundreds of megawatts. This is just a little bit of a sneak peek at what we might be looking at in 2019. These are just the proposed projects, not necessarily awarded, but at least some of these will be going through. And of course, with all of those large-scale renewables coming online in the coming years, we are going to need a lot of battery energy storage installed to support them. So those targets are also pretty ambitious. Again, I think some of the most ambitious, if not the most ambitious in the country. We're looking to install 3,000 megawatts just of energy storage by the year 2030. And we're getting there by putting a good amount of money behind it. We have $400 million set aside for incentives, and also we're offering technical assistance. One of the forms of that technical assistance is my team working with local governments across the state. And just a brief overview of what our team does. So we started out mostly focusing on solar, and we developed this solar guidebook. You can see a little snapshot of some of the stuff that's included in it on the right-hand side of the screen. We have model zoning laws in there. We can help communities develop pilot agreements and even procurement and a whole slew of things. Again, don't really have too much time to get into it, but that guidebook has been really popular over the last few years and helped out a lot of local governments get prepared for solar development. So we went ahead and tried to replicate it for battery energy storage. This guidebook has only 4 chapters. It's a lot smaller than the solar guide. It just came out in April of this year, but we're hoping to add more chapters to it over time as we get out in the field and see what the communities need. The major components here are model battery energy storage law. I'll give you a peek at that in a little bit. Model permit for smaller systems, an electrical inspection checklist to help code officials when they're out in the field inspecting these things. And then finally, a copy of our updated fire code in the state, which I'm going to get into a little bit later when we talk about some of the safety issues associated with these and what New York State has done to address that. And I think one of the presenters may have their phone not on mute, and it probably should be on mute. There's a little bit of background noise. And again, all of the stuff that I'm going to be presenting today is available on our website. So again, try not to get too bogged down and taking in every word on the slides. You'll have these after, and you can come here and download everything. With the one caveat that the battery energy storage guidebook, we're in the middle of a revision, and I expect a brand new version of it to be posted, I would say within a week or so. So if you go to our website immediately after this webinar, you may notice some discrepancies between what I'm presenting on the slides and what's in the guidebook. The slides have been updated. The website will follow soon. Just keep that in mind. All right, so this looks a little bit familiar. You saw this on Catherine's slide, but why are we even talking about battery energy storage? Why is it so popular? It's not just about, you know, the sun isn't always shining, the wind isn't always blowing, so we need to have batteries to help back that up and fill in the blanks when those aren't serving the grid. It also has other services that it provides to, like, the grid and also to individual consumers. It can provide frequency regulation for the grid. Of course, it can provide emergency backup power, the more traditional use for battery energy storage. It can help meet peak demand for both the grid and individual buildings, perhaps even reducing the demand charge for certain large commercial buildings, and a whole other slew of benefits to the grid. This is just a little snapshot of what the grid of the future might look like that we're working to build right now. Lots of renewables, some traditional power, all of which feeding into battery energy storage, that can sometimes go directly to a building and other times back into the grid and back and forth like that. This is one of those slides that you don't want to spend too much time trying to digest right now, but the point of this is there are a bunch of different battery energy storage technologies. We're going to focus on the right-hand side here, lithium ion. It tends to be the most popular. It's the same type of battery that you have in your cell phones, your laptops, your electric vehicles. They're getting better and cheaper as the market demands more and more of them. And if you look over on the right-hand side of this chart, you can sort of see why. It has a very high efficiency, has a reasonable duration, reasonable time to build, low operating costs, small amount of space required. They're very energy dense, and the technology is commercialized and ready to go. So that's one of the reasons most of the systems we're going to see going in are lithium ion, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on for most of this. So just a little background on battery energy storage system design. So you start out with a cell, and these are, you know, small cells like you might see, not too much bigger than your typical AA battery or the battery in your cell phone perhaps. String a bunch of those together, you have a module. String a bunch of modules together, you have a rack. String a bunch of racks together, it's a battery energy storage system. So keeping in mind those little cells for later in the presentation, when we talk about some of the fire safety issues, that'll be important. So just remember that these systems are made up of lots and lots of small cells all just wired together. All of these systems will also have what we refer to as a battery management system. It's basically just the brains of the system, and it can monitor each and every one of those individual cells that I was just talking about and let you know if there are any potential issues with them and potentially even shut down or isolate if there are any trouble cells to prevent fire and other negative things that you don't want to see. And just to give you an idea of what they look like and where they can be located, like I said before, the energy storage systems can provide grid services. You might see those on the utility side of the meter. Those are going to be the much larger systems, like 600 kilowatt hours and above. And then on the other side, they can be behind the meter, just serving like an individual building or facility. It can be residential, perhaps something the size of a suitcase hanging on the wall in someone's garage, or a few racks of batteries, maybe in the basement of a large commercial building. Like any other development project, energy storage systems are subject to all the applicable codes: fire code, building code, residential code, national electric code. I think most folks, if you have any familiarity with energy storage, you may have heard that fire is one of the most major concerns with the lithium-ion systems. And so I'm going to be getting into the fire code stuff in a little bit. I'm just kind of teeing that up here. All right. So I'm not going to go through every section. This is an outline of the contents of the model law that we have for battery energy storage that we share with local governments around the state. It's totally comprehensive. While it technically could be adopted as is, we encourage all of our local governments to make edits to it as they see fit. So I'm just going to show you a couple little snapshots and go over in very low level of detail a couple of the sections. So all throughout the law, you'll see there are some sections that are bracketed and highlighted, and that indicates that that's certainly a spot where a local government should edit it. But everything else is sort of all laid out for them so that, you know, they don't have to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on lawyers to start from scratch. We've kind of done the legwork for them, and they can just tweak it to suit their needs. In the law, we've divided up systems into two tiers. Those that are smaller, less than or equal to 600 kilowatt hours, and only made up of one type of battery energy storage technology. And then those that are bigger, or that maybe have more than one type of technology that could potentially negatively interact with each other in the same space. And you'll see in a second that they have different requirements in the law based on that. So for those smaller tier 1 energy storage systems, those can be permitted with that model permit that I mentioned earlier. And the inspection checklist can also be used by the code official to check those. And of course, they're subject to all applicable fire codes. A lot of the smaller systems are going to be subject to the International Residential Code, but some the International Fire Code, which are the two codes that New York State anyway uses for ours. We adopt versions of them. And for those larger tier 2 systems, we do not recommend using that model permit. We recommend them going through a special use permit process and site plan review. And again, of course, the applicable fire code. And all these things are outlined in that model law. Got just a couple more photos showing you what tier 1 might look like. We saw some of it earlier. Here's a couple more examples. And tier 2. These can get quite large. In fact, in the upper right-hand corner, those are shipping containers full of batteries, and you can see many, many, many of them sometimes together. It's a quick little snapshot of that model permit that I was talking about. Much like the model law, everything's set where it can essentially be adopted as is, but there are parts throughout where it's indicated for the local government to make edits as they see fit and customize it for their own needs. And again, this is for those smaller tier 1 systems. And it just captures, you know, some basic information about the project, what type of battery it is, where it's located, some contact information, things you might see on a typical permit. And then also at the very end, it outlines all of the additional attachments and general requirements that the projects need to meet. And again, all of this can be edited and customized. All of these documents, the model law, the model permit, we have Word versions available online, so folks can download, edit as they see fit. All of you, if you find that this would be helpful in your state or in your work, you're free to download it and share it as you please as well. In fact, I hope you do. So again, not going through the entire model law, but I want to pull out a couple key points. So this is a really high-level overview of what we include in the law for those larger Tier 2 systems. So on the left-hand side, we have the process for approval, and again, some of that can be customized. And on the right-hand side, all of those are sections in the law that have a lot more detail. Again, not going to go into it though, but I do want to point out the decommissioning section, which is always one of the biggest questions that come up when we're working with local governments is what's going to happen to these things at the end of their useful life. So according to the fire code, the version of the fire code that New York State has right now, they all have to have a decommissioning plan in order to be permitted. But what goes above and beyond that in this model law is over on the right-hand side of the screen. We recommend that local governments require a decommissioning fund on top of that decommissioning plan, so that on day one of that system being built, the local government has money in their pocket should anything happen, God forbid, like the developer or owner skip the country or go bankrupt or something, or otherwise be unable to deal with the system at the end of its useful life, the local government will have the funding in their pocket on day one to take care of that themselves. And then we go through and outline all of the different components that should be included in any site plan application for a battery energy storage system. We can go ahead and skip right through all of this to number 13 down on the bottom right-hand side that is highlighted. This is one thing that while the most recent fire code that we adopted is great and comprehensive and the best there is right now, the one thing that is missing from it is an emergency operations plan. So we've included that in our model law and recommend that local governments require it so that first responders can be trained in how to deal with these systems before they're built and know what to do in an event of emergency and who's going to be doing what. Very important. And this is why that is very important. So if you go back to the slide where I was showing you cells, the small cells all strung together, making modules, if something happens to one of those cells, particularly in lithium-ion systems that are all kind of crammed in there pretty close together, any kind of abuse, be it something punctures one of those cells, maybe the HVAC stops working and they overheat, or some other kind of damage happens, and that one cell starts to overheat a little bit, it'll start off-gassing, eventually smoke, and perhaps eventually cause a fire. And those other little cells that are right next to it, then they start to overheat when that one starts to overheat, and it can start propagating and become a much larger event, even though it was all started with just one little cell. And so this is just like a visual representation of that happening. And one of the best ways to deal with it, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is actually to use water to cool the cells because it's the best thing to do that. But to even prevent this from happening in the beginning, going back to that battery management system. So if you start at like 12 o'clock on the very top of this circle and we kind of work our way around clockwise, you start with all of the preventative things, and then going into containment and like responding to emergencies should something happen with these systems. And all of these items, as you work your way around, a lot of this stuff is covered in the most recent version of the fire code that we've adopted, which is the proposed 2021 International Fire Code. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit more detail in a second. All right, so up until July of this year, New York State had been referencing the 2015 International Fire Code, which only had a very, very, very small section on battery energy storage in it. It didn't address all of the different types and possible scenarios of installations and all of these things. We were going to be set to adopt the 2018 International Fire Code, which has an entire chapter for battery energy storage and is much more comprehensive than the 2015 International Fire Code. However, we were able to work with our state Department of State to issue an emergency rule earlier this year, essentially adopting the 2021 version of the International Fire Code, just the battery energy storage chapter, because it takes all of the great things about the 2018 code and goes a step farther and has specific requirements based on where the systems are going to be located and how they're designed. And I believe we are the first in the country to have this stringent of a fire code, and that's because of some of those issues that I touched on earlier about possible fire problems. And so this is a little snapshot of kind of what's different about that 2021 code. It has specific requirements based on where they're located. So if on the top left-hand side, if you're in a dedicated use building and that building contains nothing but battery energy storage systems and has no other use or occupancy, maybe the requirements in the code are a little bit more lenient than if you go down below that to a non-dedicated use building where you might have office workers in there during the day. The fire requirements are going to be a little bit more stringent. Same thing for even the outdoor systems are a little bit more lenient than any of the indoor systems, but if they're near exposures outside, they have some slightly more stringent requirements than an outdoor remote system that's out in the middle of a field somewhere and isn't going to hurt anyone if it catches fire. I do want to reiterate, though, that with this most recent version of the fire code, if all it is followed, like the fire issue becomes almost a non-issue. There are so many safety precautions built into it, and that's why New York was able to issue that emergency ruling earlier this year, just out of an abundance of caution. We're funding these things, we're seeing them pop up all across the state, we're incentivizing more and more of them, and we want to make sure it's done in the safest way possible to make sure that we don't have an incident. And again, this is a very short presentation, so we don't have time to get into every aspect of the code, but I wanted to highlight a couple of what I think are some of the more important things that are in there. For the larger systems, they have to do a hazard mitigation analysis that basically shows what will happen if something, one of those cells does start to overheat. How is the system designed to respond to contain that and remain safe? On top of that, there's some fire remediation requirements whereby actually the owner of the system needs to have somebody on call who knows exactly how to deal with that particular system in the event of an emergency, and they can help guide first responders with what to do. In addition, they also have to have that person be on call to show up and sort of babysit the scenario after an incident occurs, so we don't have to be paying our first responders and firefighters to sit around for 24 hours and make sure that batteries don't catch fire again. So you're putting a lot of responsibility on the system owner, which is good. This is one of many, many, many requirements throughout the code to keep these things safe. So one of them is the size and separation requirement. You want to have 3 feet between any of the blocks of batteries. You don't want any of the blocks to be greater than 50 kilowatt hours, and this is to reduce the spread of fire should it occur, which again should be rare if the rest of the fire code is being followed. And then down on the lower left-hand corner of the screen in red, you'll see text that says the fire code official is authorized to approve larger capacities or smaller separation distances based on large-scale fire testing. And that's not just for this size and separation requirement. You'll see that same exception scattered throughout the fire code in different parts, whereby should the developer of the system choose to do this large-scale fire testing on it, which is basically setting a test case on fire and seeing what happens and proving that if it does catch fire, it's actually not going to pose a safety threat to anyone. And so if it can pass that, some of the requirements in the fire code can actually be reduced a little bit. And like I was saying earlier, so of course, if you dump water all over a bunch of batteries, it's going to permanently ruin them. So you don't necessarily want to do that at first. So while it's not a totally 100% directly prescribed pathway, generally what we've seen is it's best to have two types of fire suppression systems: gas or some other non-water type system to snuff out flames initially and stop it. And if that's not sufficient to stop the spread of the fire once the thermal runaway is underway, and that's what I was describing earlier, where one cell heats up and the ones next to it start heating up, and they start this like positive reinforcement thing going on. At some point, water may be the only way to actually cool it down and stop it. So you also, it's desirable to have some sort of water system as well. So having both could be a great idea. All right, again, that was really, really, really fast, squeezing 2 hours of stuff into a 15-minute snapshot. I just wanted to give you sort of a taste of what we have going on, and you can find more in the guidebooks on our website, and we're happy to take questions now too. And I'll go back to Catherine, I believe.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I apologize, I actually would like to take questions after we review the case studies.
Yeah.
And I'd like to thank Jen for doing a 15-minute overview on what is typically a very deep dive. And I think she did an excellent job balancing a demonstration of the types of products that NYSERDA is creating for local governments, along with what they contain. And what I would like everyone to take away from her segment of the presentation is that, especially for our folks who are not working directly in energy or in disaster education, is that you do not need to reinvent the wheel in your state in order to have the resources you need to safely, at the local level, adopt local policy and do project development for energy storage. New York State is truly leading in setting the gold standard when it comes to not only facilitating the development of this technology for people who are investors and the utility companies. They are also stepping out into a role in a way that I have never seen from a state agency in the United States, and ensuring that local governments, communities, extension personnel, other community education groups and nonprofits are fully engaged in this process. And they do that through a flagship program, which is how Jen and I work together, which is through the Clean Energy Communities program. So I'm going to go ahead and just make sure everybody knows how to navigate to that website, because it contains a wealth of resources, some of which are technical and others which are fact sheets that are appropriate for people who have a variety of baseline literacy about energy technology. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, is everyone seeing my screen?
Yep.
Okay, let me go to the correct slide. Okay, so that resource that Jen was referring to is one among many that the Clean Energy Communities program uses to educate individuals, local governments about how this clean energy technology, as well as energy storage technology, is being deployed. So I would encourage you to reach out to me if you'd like to learn more about that program. I'd be happy to direct you to Brad Tito, the program manager at NYSERDA, because this has been an amazing relationship that the Cornell Cooperative Extension has developed over the last few years with NYSERDA, and it has led New York State to be a leader in assisting communities with adopting these technologies in a safe and responsible way. And within the last 6 months, start to integrate the idea of all hazards preparedness into the policy associated with the Green New Deal. So I just cannot overemphasize enough that even if you didn't catch every single technical detail of the segment of the presentation, our goal of showing you what the depth of what's available in New York State is that we don't want you to reinvent the wheel. We want to make sure that we can guide you to appropriate resources at Extension. And I'm going to go ahead and present now a couple of case studies of existing products that we use to educate our community members. So a resource that I use on a weekly basis is the Clean Energy States Alliance webinars and fact sheets. We won't go into too great a depth of this case study because I want to leave sufficient time for questioning. However, I think this is an excellent report for everyone on the webinar to read through. This case study is of the Stafford Hill Solar Farm and Microgrid, which is located in Vermont. It was an effort undertaken by Vermont's largest utility, Green Mountain Power, which has a reputation for being involved in projects that benefit communities, particularly the creation of solar storage microgrids. This is particularly relevant to rural communities, which oftentimes, whenever a natural disaster occurs, are the last communities to have power restored. So the process that the utility used to engage the community and the local government is assisting that community with saving hundreds of thousands of dollars in electricity by a process called peak shaving, which we won't get into, but is another one of those co-benefits of battery energy storage technology. The focus that I'd like to consider is that this project also supplies backup power to an emergency shelter. If you're interested in the details, and it is your role in the community to educate folks about this, you can read the technical and financial details yourself. There's also a great section on lessons learned over the course of the project. And just to give you a sense of what these projects look like, they oftentimes have actually a pretty small footprint, and that's in part because we want them to make sure they're contained behind fences, that there's less space to maintain. And again, I encourage you to go through the Clean Energy States Alliance's Energy Storage Resources tab. There are numerous examples. I just thought this was the best one to showcase today because it was a great partnership between Vermont's Department of Public Safety as well as the Department of Energy. There were several groups from the Department of Energy that assisted with the design and construction of this project. And so I think it's a good model for us to all be aware of if you're seeking to create a project like this in your community. And just a few key details. This is mostly just for everyone to digest and to be able to reference after the webinar. But this was a $5.5 million project. It did receive about $290,000 in project funding and in-kind assistance. So that's a technique that you can use to reduce the cost of these projects in your community. And if you have any questions about this kind of project development, I ask that you reach out to Jen and to me directly so that we can share with you our experience with these projects in New York State. What I also liked about this project is from the beginning, they involved the Red Cross in developing the design characteristics for the emergency shelter, as well as a regional high school. And I think that, again, emphasizes a theme that is emerging throughout our webinar here today, which is that it's good early on, even with the complexity of this energy technology and all of the literature we need to wade through to understand what's going on, to involve community members at every level as early as we can in the design of these projects. Also just wanted to showcase one of the best fact sheets that I have seen actually comes from the University of Michigan on US grid energy storage, and just wanted folks to have access to that. And also wanted to point everyone toward the new community website for the Clean Energy Communities program. There is a statewide website through NYSERDA, which I displayed the link for earlier. This is what my team at the Cornell Cooperative Extension created for 8 counties in the southern tier of New York that borders Pennsylvania. And I wanted to highlight the resources tab in the upper right. We have all of our webinars, case studies, and tools. This website was just released, and I think it's an excellent example of how we are at the Cooperative Extension, the Cornell Cooperative Extension, taking this very dense technical literature and translating it into a usable way for a variety of different community members. I'd like this just to be the very start of what I hope will become a regular conversation with our Eden folks. And so I wanted to highlight 2 upcoming webinars of interest. Today we were focusing on just learning the basics about energy storage technology and how it can be applied to backup power. The next 2 webinars that the Clean Energy Group is hosting on Wednesday, January 22nd, how solar knowledge spreads, who learns what from whom and how. And I think that this would be an excellent webinar for extension personnel to attend, because it's going to focus on what are those best practices that educators involved in facilitating the development of solar projects in communities, what they've learned over the last few years, which is obviously directly applicable to how we would structure effective public education campaigns related to energy storage. Another upcoming webinar is Financing Resilient Power in Under-Resourced Communities, a Foundation's comprehensive financing initiative for solar storage projects. This is going to be Tuesday, January 28th. And I thought that would be excellent to highlight, because that's the next step, obviously, is understanding the basics about the technology, about how to responsibly develop those projects, and also how do you finance them, particularly in the high-risk areas where people would most benefit from the use of capacity building grants to actually ensure that these projects get sited in communities where people are would be impacted most by power outages. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone so much for your time, and go ahead and open up for about 15 minutes in questions. I saw some chat as well, so take it away, Rodney.
All right, I'm trying to get to the questions here. Thank you, Catherine and Jennifer. We'll go ahead and take some time for questions. Just a reminder, please be sure to type your questions into the chat box in your control panel. And let's see here. Bear with me, folks.
Take your time. I did see a question early on about UCANR's community needs assessment, and the attendee joined late, so I can go back to slides 5 and 6 if that's a place to start, Rodney.
Okay, looks like, how do you recommend, I'm trying to get to the first question here.
I'm excited. There was a lot of chatter in the chat box during the presentation.
Right, and I see the group chat here. Let's see. Looks like it says Michael Chipotle. To everyone here, said he has some concerns about accessibility of these systems, and if there's a mandatory permitting process that is needed to go along with it. Many in the disabled community have to go through endless paperwork, government process, medical processes, etc., and will most likely be discouraged in even applying for a permit, because it's just another set of hoops to jump through. Is there any talk about mitigating the burden of permit process for those who need these to provide life-saving power?
I will take a stab at that first. Michael, I agree that it can be very difficult to engage effectively with this community and ensure that our resources are accessible. I think that your question needs to be directed toward the, California Public Utilities Commission, which is the first state that is seeking to, totally take care of the costs for those parties. But you're absolutely right. Just because they're willing to, to take care of the cost doesn't mean that the program is accessible. And I would encourage you to reach out to Karim Beers at the Cornell Cooperative Extension to learn what he has learned from the Smart Energy Choices program that he directs across New York State. That's a program that directly engages with residents and assists them with developing clean energy projects on their homes, either for renters or for homeowners, and has specialists that engage with the low income community as well as folks who are disabled. So I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer that question, and I do agree that it needs to be first and foremost a focus. Otherwise, the program wouldn't be truly accessible. Great question. And do you want to add anything to that, Jen?
No, I can't really. I mean, the only response I had was that the model permit that we've developed for those smaller systems is designed to make that process a little bit easier, but there's nothing specifically for those with disabilities in there to streamline it or anything. But it's certainly something for us to keep in mind, to keep thinking about going forward. While we might be ahead of some states, as far as a lot of this stuff goes, we still have a long way to go, and we're really just getting started and learning right along with everyone else too.
Thanks, Jen. And I did also just add the link to the Smart Energy Choices program and reference Corinne Beers in the chat so that Michael can go ahead and reach out to that contact who may have more information. All right, well, what's next for us, Rodney?
Okay, from Paul Mutalo. How do you recommend municipalities overcome the cost gap compared with diesel generators, especially for long 6-hour events?
That's an excellent question, and I think that I wish I had somebody from FEMA on the webinar here with us to talk more about their experience with diesel generators, since I work predominantly with battery energy storage, not diesel. But what I would say in general, and I've seen in New York State, is it's important especially when we're in a response situation, to just cut through the red tape so that people can allocate funding and procure diesel generators as quickly as possible. Does that answer the question?
I'm hoping it answers the question.
So didn't see any motion in the chat there.
Yeah, I see there's a comment from Paul Westfall. That much battery storage to see the 2030 and the 2040 goals will have a very large footprint. And he says, I would encourage setting these storage units in locations that will not remove farmland from production.
Would you like to comment on that, Jen?
Sorry, I got lost reading one of the chat questions. Can you repeat that one?
Sure. So the gentleman, Paul, is asking, he's commenting to minimize the disruption or use of farmland production.
Yes, I did see that.
Because of a large footprint of battery energy storage. So any comments on that?
Not at the moment, although, I mean, we see the same issue coming up with solar all across the state. It remains a concern with many of the towns. I would say it's been less of a concern with battery energy storage, because while certainly meeting our goal, like you said, would have a large footprint, it's relatively small because they're so energy dense, but it's certainly something to keep in mind, and that's something that can also be incorporated into the law, having maximum percentages of certain types of farmland that can be converted or used for this type of thing. And a lot of that will be up to the individual towns. Some care more than others about preserving it and have different types of land around. That's really all I can say at this point.
And I'll also add to that in the chat, Paul, I just put a link to some research at Cornell that was just underway, I think this month, that is related to the co-location of energy production, which would include battery energy storage systems and use for agriculture. Most likely it would be only on the production side. This relates to the benefits that solar can have in shading livestock, particularly sheep seem amenable to being co-located with solar. We're also looking into what other valuable agricultural products can be co-located with solar, given that we know that plants do not uptake all of the sunlight throughout the day. And there's a great research group at Cornell doing that work. There's also another at University of Arizona I'd be happy to point you toward. Because definitely I think that land footprint is a big concern that a number of communities are going to have about how these new energy technologies, including energy storage systems, are going to impact their communities.
Okay. All right, we have for Jennifer, for an Article 10 project that aims to have storage, would storage be wrapped up within Article 10, or would it be permitted separately and through local permitting procedures?
Yeah, so if they include the storage in the Article 10 application, it can go through the Article 10 process right along with the generation it's associated with. I'm still a little bit hairy myself on what happens if they decide to add it, you know, a year later after, for example, a solar farm might be built. But I do know that if it's included in the application from the get-go, it goes through Article 10.
And for those of us who are not in New York State, I just provided a background in what Article 10 is in New York State. It's a governance for major electric generating facilities larger than 25 megawatts. And which I think everyone should pay close attention how the legal, I wouldn't say the legal proceedings, but how Article 10 streamlines the application process for developers, because that's going to, especially for our ag educators at the extension, that's a great example of how I think other states are going to end up developing their framework for these siting committees, which do include both local representation and state representation. Because ultimately, we're taking a little bit further away from the emergency management aspect here, but the other thing to recognize, and what I'm sure a number of our extension personnel are interested in, is, you know, these are major land use changes that also have the potential to change our community fabric, change our farming communities. And that's partly why I work at this intersection, is that I want to make sure that we capture all of the potential local benefits of these projects that do have these large land footprints.
Okay. All right, folks, I think our time is just about up. I want to thank everyone. We appreciate you for participating in our webinar today. A reminder that this webinar will be archived on the Eden YouTube channel and distributed through the listserv. Please take a moment to complete the evaluation found at the link provided in the chat box. And thank you. Have a wonderful day.